Hi and welcome to Rethinking Grammar, a talk by Andrew Walkley and Hugh Dellar. We're both teachers and teacher trainers at University of Westminster in London, and we also write for National Geographic Learning. A few years ago, Andrew was at a conference and he saw Catherine Walters, who some of you might know from Walters and Swan, worked with Michael Swan, and she was talking about grammar. And she happened to mention in the talk that the root of the word grammar was the same as the word glamour. And you can kind of see why. Because glamour is used to sell magazines and sell films and things like that, whilst grammar sells most things in English language teaching. Glamour is also about status and wonder. And so, of course, is grammar. It's where teachers gain most of their power from their grammar knowledge. And students obviously also feed into this. I'm sure if you are a teacher, you've had students come to you asking things like, "Teacher, please tell me how I can perfect my grammar. Teacher, I need more grammar. Teacher, what's the difference between must, shall, should, would, can, could and might? Teacher, I'm really keen to do the first conditional, but I am concerned of my grammar." And as a teacher, it can be very difficult to resist these pleas. But I think it's worth asking, really, what they mean. Is, for example, the difference between must, shall, should, can, could, might really a question of grammar? And if it is, what is the grammar teaching that will help it? Because, in fact, again, a bit like glamour, if you think about it, the surface image and the substance don't always mix particularly well. So, welcome to the talk. Hopefully by the end of it you'll have some different perspectives on grammar. And yeah, that's what we're aiming to do here. So, let's begin. This man here is Toby Young. He's a champion of the controversial free schools movement in the UK. And he's a champion of teaching Latin to 6-year-olds. You can see that he's thinking. Maybe he's rethinking grammar too, because he was recently on the judging panel of a new thing called the Bad Grammar Awards. And interestingly, the recipient of the Bad Grammar Award that Toby Young was responsible for choosing was a letter to a newspaper. And it was a letter from teachers attacking plans by the current Education Minister, Michael Gove. And the fact that Toby Young chose to attack a letter attacking Michael Gove is clearly a very politically motivated kind of act. But let's have a look at the extract that he chose to award the Bad Grammar Prize to. Okay, let's have a look at this shocking, dreadful, civilization-destroying piece of grammar that demands the return of more formal education that Toby Young advocates. So here it is. Have a quick read through that. Do you get what the problem is here? For those of you who are used to dealing with your average EFL student, you're probably amazed by the lack of dropped third-person S's, by the correct use of will. Probably to most of us here, this seems like a perfectly satisfactory piece of English, but not to the likes of Toby Young. Apparently, if you remove bits of the sentences, okay, you get things like this. Little account is taken of that young children need to relate abstract ideas to their experience. Okay? As you can see, if you remove the first part of the sentence after taken account of, you can see that the second part doesn't follow, apparently. Although actually I think as good readers and as proper grammarians, perhaps in your head when you're reading that, you heard take account of the fact that. And you simply read over the absence of the fact. Okay? To me it hardly seems to be the gravest of errors, especially given that this is a letter to a newspaper where words need to be kept at a minimum and where, elision is quite common. The other mistake, for those of you who didn't hear or read about it, was it demands too much too young. Gwyn, who is one of the judges' other awards, one of the awards' other judges, states, and it's worth quoting this thing in full, okay? Presumably, they mean something like demands too much when children are too young to be ready for so much, but as worded, it is simply not English. Young is an adjective and cannot ever be an adverb. Obviously, if you want your own pomposity to be flaunted, it may well be more appropriate to express oneself in the said manner, demands too much when children are too young to be ready for so much. Personally, I think for the rest of us, we'll probably continue to use young as an adverb in the same way as we have done for a long time. You know, we all say things like, they married too young, I started too young. And we follow these kind of patterns like go too far, too fast, do too little, too late, reach too high, too far, too soon, which all make use of all kinds of other non-conventional adverbs. Or we might continue to play with language by adopting lyrics, like a lyric from a famous song by The Specials called Too Much, Too Young. Big hit when both me and Andrew were kids, and #1 hit, I believe. And it's got great lyrics, you know. You've done too much, too young. You're married with a kid when you should be having fun with me. So, you know, the idea that young is not an adjective, is an adjective and can only ever be an adjective and can never be an adverb, I would suggest the evidence of the way in which the language is used in reality contradicts such a bold kind of statement. Other issues that Toby Young and Gwyn found with the actual extract that we looked at were, for example, the fact that it talks about children, and it talks about, what was it? Young children need to relate abstract ideas to their experience, lives and activity. And they're annoyed that experience and activity here seemingly in the singular, whereas lives is in the plural. But, you know, you think about it, experience is often used as a kind of uncountable noun. You know, he has a lot of experience. It's slightly different from he's had a lot of experiences. So, you know, I read this as they're talking about the experience of young kids as a whole, as a kind of complete thing. The activity of young kids as a whole. And actually, if you think about it, you can't make life here singular. You know, if you want to match it grammatically, their experience, life and activity. But you can keep experience and activity singular, like this. But, you know, people like Toby Young obviously find this kind of thing very, very annoying. And actually, you know, we play with language all the time. When we were putting this talk together, we were thinking about, you know, taking a title from a movie and playing with it. So some of you may know the Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Sex But Were Afraid to Ask Woody Allen movie. We could have called this Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Grammar But Were Afraid to Ask. Or we could have called it The Rise and Fall of the Grammar Empire. Sadly, something which is not yet fulfilled. But it seems that this kind of playing with language like this and taking fixed things and tweaking them slightly is not something that Toby Young or Gwyn or many other people approve of. In their universe, words have their preordained space and position in a sentence, rather like people having preordained places in society. Young must be an adjective. Though, of course, it's also a proper noun in Toby Young's case. But it will never be, can never be, an adverb, and I will send anyone to the headmaster if they try to use it like that. But, of course, as I've said before, grammar and words don't work like that. If they did, if we never changed the way words work, we'd all still be speaking the same language as Shakespeare. Wait, no, we wouldn't. We'd all still be speaking the same language as Chaucer. No, actually, we'd all be speaking the same language as Beowulf. No, actually, we'd all be speaking in grunts and in mumblings. Instead, actually, of course, words, meanings, form, grammar constantly interact and develop based on what we hear and based on what we experience. So in this view, you know, too much, too young is correct because it follows those patterns I've already mentioned. It follows our experience of how the word is used in our generation. Also in this way, of course, the idea of correctness, okay, is never an absolute thing. It's simply something that's shared by the majority. Yeah? For a TEFL person, for someone working as a teacher of English as a foreign language, this is a big question because you have a state now where English is used as a lingua franca. Okay? You know, it's used as a kind of global language. And what is the shared majority view of correctness? You know, perhaps the correct view of grammar should be something like the narrator of Everything is Illuminated by Jonathan Safran Foer. This was a great novel by a Jewish New Yorker writer a few years ago, and it was made into a movie. And one of the characters in there is a translator, a Ukrainian translator called Alexander Perchov. And in a minute I'm going to show you his letter. I've just realised I haven't mentioned what all this quote at the bottom is here. Yeah, this stuff about he that outlives this day and comes safe home shall yearly on the vigil feast his friends and say tomorrow is St. Cryspines' day. This is Shakespeare, okay? You know, the great bard of English language. And if you look here, comes safe home, you'll notice safe, it's being used as an adverb. So, you know, people like Toby Young, is Shakespeare wrong? Did Shakespeare use grammar badly? Apparently not, because we're all forced to study him at school. Anyway, let's return to this Everything is Illuminated character, Alexander Perchov. Okay? Here's an extract where it is his introduction letter to the narrator in the book, and it's written in his own rather peculiar version of English. There it is. I'll read it with my Russian accent, because I do love doing a Russian accent, or Ukrainian accent. Apologies to any Ukrainians listening. My legal name is Alexander Perchov, but all of my many friends dub me Alex, because that is a more flaccid-to-utter version of my legal name. Mother dubs me Alexi-stop-spleening-me, because I am always spleening her. If you want to know why I am always spleening her, it is because I am always elsewhere with friends and disseminating so much currency and performing so many things that can spleen a mother. Father used to dub me Shapka for the fur hat I would don even in the summer month. He ceased dubbing me that because I ordered him to cease dubbing me that. It sounded boyish to me, and I have always thought of myself as very potent and generative. There you go. Is that English as a lingua franca? Is that what we should teach? Is that what we want? I think what's interesting about this particular extract is actually it illustrates both the limits of the Toby Young view of grammar and of the idea that grammar is just these fixed grammar slots plus words that can be dropped into them, which is still really the kind of dominant view of how grammar works that exists in English language teaching. And it also kind of illustrates how language development might actually work. We want grammar to be potent and generative and to allow us to produce an infinite number of correct sentences, yet actually the result frequently is things like Alexi's weird speech. With the exception of spleen, which is a noun and is always a noun and can never be a verb, or so God strike me down with a bolt of lightning and eviscerate me till I am nothing. With the exception of spleen, actually what you have here is a perfectly grammatical passage, as Toby Young essentially conceives grammar. But it's very difficult to follow, and for most native speakers, and possibly for non-natives as well, quite hard to understand, and possibly quite comic. As you read the novel, actually, over time, of course, you become used to Alexi's usage, and you can learn his own kind of weird version of English. But for most of us it will be incorrect because we don't share the usage of the way he's using words. We don't use words like dub or flaccid or utter or disseminate or, you know, many others here in the way that he does. Okay? The interesting thing is, from my point of view, is that what's wrong with his English here is not really grammar, okay? He uses the wrong words, essentially. But in what way are they the wrong words, and how do we know? Okay? You know, if you just change it to things like, many of my friends call me Alex because that is an easier to utter version of my legal name. Mother calls me Alexi-stop-spleening-me. It's still quite weird, yeah? And again, think about what happens with students' English, okay, when you're teaching. Here are some examples of some of the kinds of things that students often say or often write. Stop for a minute and ask yourselves, do you think these are examples of the wrong word, or are they examples of the wrong grammar? Okay, have a quick look. Possibly, if you're anything like most of the teachers that we talk to about these kind of things, you're screaming saying, grammar, grammar, they're all grammar problems, everything's grammar. Well, are they? Okay? You might be thinking the first one should just be, do you want to travel a lot? But actually, I think probably the question is better as, would you like to travel a lot? Okay? So, is that a grammar problem? Is the fact they've gone for are you want to instead of would you like to? Is that grammar, or is that a phrase, or is that some kind of complex interrelationship between words and grammar and chunks? Possibly you're looking at, he put down me for the problem, and you're thinking, no, it's grammar, because put down is a phrasal verb, and you can't use it like this. If you use me, you have to say, he put me down for the problem. But even if you correct it to, he put me down for the problem, surely it's better as something like, he blamed me for the problem, or he criticised me for the problem. So, you know, while on the surface you may think it's a grammar problem, possibly it's more of a kind of lexical or a vocabulary problem. She's been knowing him for a while. Many of you are probably screaming, of course this is a grammar problem. Know is a stative verb and it can never be used in the present perfect continuous. If that's true, why do we say things like, how long have you been seeing him? Okay? Or, you know, I've been wanting to see that for ages. Yeah? Those are also what we often think of as stative verbs. But those are used in the present perfect continuous. So why can't knowing be used in the present perfect continuous? I would argue it's simply because we don't use it like that, and our experience of the language doesn't lead us to expect it to be used like that. We need to rethink about our policies. Possibly some of you are crying, of course it's grammar, it must be grammar, it's a prepositional problem. Take away the re, we need to think about our policies. Perfectly correct English. We always tell students if you add re to a verb, it means to do again. So we need to think about our policies, we need to rethink about our policies. It's a really obvious kind of assumption to make that the language might work like that. But actually it doesn't, because you think about something, but you rethink something. Is that grammar? Certainly not in the way that most course books treat grammar, it's not. It's no point trying to convince her. As a teacher, I've long since given up really trying to logically explain or teach the difference between its and theirs. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think often it's just to do with fixed expressions and collocations and chunks. So here, there's no point trying to convince her. But you can equally say, it's no use trying to, it's no good trying to convince her. But not, there's no good, interestingly. The last one, you're probably thinking, it's grammar, because storm's a noun, it's not a verb. Okay? They look for shelter, or they're looking for shelter. You know, could be at the moment, they look for shelter now. Because it's raining, it's, you know, there's a storm going on. You might tell students, storm is never a verb. But again, not quite true, is it? Not entirely true, is it? Because, you know, you storm out of meetings, you storm out of the room, you storm off. Okay? So a lot of the time I think it's actually very difficult to articulate whether student errors are grammar or vocabulary, because essentially the vast majority of what we might see as errors are a mixture of both. individual words have their own particular grammar and their own particular usage, based on what the great Michael Hoey calls our lexical primings, which essentially means the experience we have of how words are used. However, this is not something as widely recognised as it might be. Instead, what wins, ironically, is a priming in itself, because students and teachers probably also are primed to say, my grammar is awful, rather than my words are awful, or my vocabulary is awful. And this kind of tendency, I think, is only reinforced by the kind of politicised views of language which dominate in the wider world, that tell us what young people really lack is grammar, and that teaching and training should place grammar and vocabulary separately, and should treat grammar as the glamorous star. Once you go down this road of this line of thinking, once you go down this road, the solution then always ends up being the same blunt instrument of more grammar exercises. And unfortunately, I think it creates a very narrow view of what grammar is, and leads to a kind of single dominant way of teaching. If you like, the English file, the headway way of teaching, where it's tenses, more tenses, a page of Murphy's for homework, learn a word list and hope that the words somehow drop into the tenses that you're putting together. Criticising this point of view doesn't mean the opposite. It doesn't mean there's no grammar. It doesn't mean that grammar can't be generative. It doesn't mean there's no need to pay attention to usage. Perhaps we should heed the words of the very wise Michael Swan, who once said, "The role of grammar in language courses is often discussed as if grammar were one homogeneous kind of thing. But in fact, grammar is an umbrella term for a large number of separate or loosely related language systems. They're so varied in nature that it's pointless to talk as if they should all be approached in the same way. How we integrate the teaching of structure and meaning depends to a great extent on the particular language items involved." So what Michael's saying really is grammar isn't one thing. Grammar is lots of different kinds of things. And this is something that we need to explore, something that we need to consider in more kind of detail. You know, if grammar isn't one thing, what different kinds of things, or what number of separate, loosely related systems might it actually involve? So I'm going to move on just to really consider some different kinds of things that grammar might be. Okay, and to raise some issues around this. So, what different types of grammar are there? Well, one way you might think of grammar, as Toby Young has done with Too Much, Too Young, you might think of grammar as types of words and the functions that those words serve. Okay, you might think that's simple, but as we've seen already with things like storm, it's not as simple as it always looks. Take a supposedly simple word like up. Possibly, if you're a language teacher, you're thinking, ah yes, a preposition. Well, really? They'll have to up their offer. I think you'll find it's a verb, up. Oh, the whole area is on the up. Ah, or is it a noun? I was up till 3 last night. Is that an adverb describing the verb to be, or is it an adjective, a kind of synonym for awake in this particular instance? He's up in his room. Is that a preposition, or is up in his room a prepositional phrase? Okay. My personal football team, Arsenal, if you go to a football match, you'll hear people shouting, "Up the Arsenal!" Where, you know, what is up here? It's an imperative verb. If you're confused by now as to, you know, what up actually is, you look in something like the Macmillan Dictionary, which I think is a great dictionary, and it tells you that up is a function word. This means they don't know what up is either, okay? It performs a variety of different functions and is basically learned and processed through chunks. You know, up and offer. It's on the up. I was up till 3 last night. He's up in his room. Up the Arsenal! You might think about grammar in terms of rules and forms. This is the way we often think about it in English language teaching. Obviously, this includes tenses, okay? But it also includes things like the rules for using few, little, a few, a little. I'm sure many of you have spent many happy hours slogging through that particular lesson. The rules behind using much, many and a lot of. It might include sort of, I don't know, diktats that come down to us from on high. We're told not to split infinitives, for example. So in Star Trek, where they tell you to boldly go where no man has gone before, they're wrong, because we're not supposed to do that. We're not supposed to split infinitives. Go tell Star Trek enthusiasts. It may include things like, don't say less, say fewer. Those kind of rules that people who are desperately trying to hold back the tides of time like to insist on, because it makes them feel superior if they continue to say fewer when most of the rest of us have long since given up on fewer and are basically saying less. You might think of grammar as slots that can be filled with words. Okay? This is why you see those kind of mad verb tables in the back of course books. This is one I actually have seen in a real course book. Okay? There it is in its full glory. I drive cars. I drove cars. I'm driving cars. I was driving cars. I have driven cars. I had driven cars. Supposedly examples of grammatically correct sentences in English, but I absolutely guarantee sentences that none of you watching this video have ever said. And it gets weirder because, you know, cars have been being driven. The present perfect continuous passive, which basically we never use. In the same way as we never use the past perfect continuous passive. Cars had been being driven. I mean, it's just a horrendous mouthful. Have been being, had been being. So even though supposedly these are a sort of, you know, grammatically plausible, grammatically correct sentences of the language, they're sentences which essentially will never be said because we're not primed or conditioned to use grammar in that kind of way. You might think about grammar in terms of syntax, in terms of the position of words in sentences. Going back to the thing that Toby Young picked up on, you know, little account, no account. These things could be thought of as being syntactical, you know, they have to go in these positions in these sentences. Or you might think of them as just chunks which kind of drive large parts of the way the sentences are constructed. So you learn a chunk like no account was taken of, little account has been taken of, and you know that what then follows is some kind of noun. You might think of a word like even and think, oh, the syntax of even is it goes before the verb or between an auxiliary verb and the main verb. But actually even that's more complicated because we don't just say, she doesn't even swear, I haven't even had time for a coffee. Usually we have to precede this with something else. I've had a really busy day. I haven't even had time for a coffee. She doesn't smoke, she doesn't drink, she doesn't even swear. Okay? So there's more to the use of these words than just syntax, just the position of words in sentences. There's the position of the verbs they're used with in a kind of larger discourse, if you like. You might think about grammar, and if you're an English language teacher, let's face it, this is how you are encouraged to think about grammar dominantly, as tenses and verb phrases, the English grammar in use, English language teaching canon. You know, this sort of view of language basically tells us that we have to learn the present simple forms of the verb to be before we can learn the present simple, and then we have to learn the past simple forms of the verb to be, and then we learn regular past simples, and then we learn irregular past simples, and that this is the preordained order that must never be disturbed or the world will break and sales of many, many course books will tumble. You might happen to believe that's how language works. Interestingly, in language teaching, we often think a lot about verb phrases, you know, the present perfect continuous, the past perfect continuous passive. I would suggest we don't think enough about noun phrases, okay? And particularly if you're learning academic writing or, you know, EAP, or you want to pass the IELTS exam, noun phrases are really, really important. I mean, you look here, the subject in this first sentence is the recurrence of this perennial problem in this particularly blighted corner of the country. It's quite a complicated, sophisticated piece of language. The verb phrase is. Okay? You look at the second one, you know, basically the verb, dispute. It's hard to dispute. The object here is the notion that any serious study of the nominalisation of verbs and adjectives that is so ubiquitous in academic and professional discourse in ELT has been neglected. Okay? That's, you know, a very, very sophisticated piece of language. That's grammar, but it's not grammar as we often think about it. You might think about grammar in terms of meaning and choice. Okay? You know, I live in Haringey. Always, permanently. Fact. I'm living in Kilburn at the moment. Temporary. But again, interestingly, you know, a lot of these structures are limited by context and limited by lexis. So you think about doing some shopping, you know, buying the boring stuff for your house, often goes with I've got to, because it's not fun, it's a kind of obligation. I've got to do some shopping on my way home. Going shopping, fun. I'm going to go shopping this Saturday. Okay? And, you know, maybe we think about these things in terms of meaning and choice and creativity and freedom and generativeness. But actually, we use them in very limited ways a lot of the time. You take something like the present continuous for future use, okay? Actually, all we do with that is to use it with 3 or 4 verbs most of the time. You know, I'm meeting a friend of mine, some people after work, my wife, a client. I'm having a drink with a friend, dinner with a friend, a party at my house, a barbecue next Saturday. We're going shopping, to the pub, out. Yeah, you know, we don't actually do a huge amount of things with those structures in our day-to-day lives, generally. Yeah. There are also more lexical ways of thinking about grammar, and personally, this is the way I think about grammar, and increasingly, and I guess it's the way I'd like you to think about grammar too. So you can think about grammar as lexis, grammar as phrases, okay? Things that maybe traditionally we're encouraged to think of as being grammatically generated, you can just teach and students can just learn as phrases. In the same way as when you first start learning a language, probably the first bit of language that you learn is, hi, what's your name? You learn that as a phrase, you learn that as a chunk, as a piece of lexis if you like. In the same way, you can learn, what's it like? I've never seen it, but it's supposed to be great. I've never been there, but it's supposed to be amazing. I've never read it, but it's supposed to be one of his best. I wouldn't bother if I were you. It's rubbish. It's a total waste of time. You should have told me. I would have come. I would have done something. I would have helped you. I'll do it later. I should have finished by 5. Okay? You can think of these as just being chunks, whole sentences that are commonly used, possibly in slightly varying kinds of ways, but commonly used basically as you see them here. And that I think are generally, by native speakers, they're learned as chunks and they're remembered as wholes that serve particular kind of pragmatic functions. You can think about grammar as phrases providing slots. Okay? As we said earlier, you know, one of the titles we were thinking of for this talk was Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About Grammar But Were Afraid to Ask. If you Google Everything You Ever Wanted to Know About plus But Were Afraid to Ask, you'll find all kinds of variations on the original Woody Allen movie. Often seems to be a title that people giving boring presentations in offices go for. So, you know, everything you ever wanted to know about Excel spreadsheets, but were afraid to ask. Everything you ever wanted to know about PowerPoint presentations, but were afraid to ask. So, hi, sorry about that. There was a knock at the door and I had to go and answer it, and I got delayed, which is the problem of making these kind of videos to go with talks from a little office in the back of my house whilst my normal life goes on around me. Anyway, one way of thinking about grammar is also this idea of phrases providing slots. So I think I talked already about everything you ever wanted to know about PowerPoint presentations but were afraid to ask, everything you ever wanted to know about Excel spreadsheets but were afraid to ask. In the same way, the phrase from Star Trek, you know, it's life, Jim, but not as we know it. This idea of it's something, Jim, but not as we know it. If you Google that, again, there's loads and loads and loads of examples of people playing with that kind of phrase. You know, we do this all the time when we're speaking. Yeah, it's grammar, Jim, but not as we know it. And in the same kind of way, on a very mundane sort of everyday kind of basis, you can think about phrases providing slots as grammar, if you like. So, you know, if you take the present continuous for asking about future plans, what are you doing? There's all kinds of little variations that kind of alter. What are you doing tonight? What are you doing after this? What are you doing after class? What are you doing this afternoon? What are you doing this weekend? Interestingly though, you know, some phrases are just learned as chunks, basically. They're just learned as whole bits of language. If you take the idea of there's no pleasing some people, okay? There's no way a student will ever be able to construct this sentence simply by studying grammar rules and meanings and then learning single words. You have to basically encounter this and learn this as a phrase. And this one doesn't really break down and generate. You know, you might think logically it should be able to because grammar tells us that things are generative. But actually, you know, there's no pleasing people. Perfectly correct English. There's no angering some people. Little bit strange, isn't it? Why? It should be grammatically correct. Yeah, but we don't use language like that. That's not what we do with it. That's not how we're primed or conditioned to expect the language to work. Okay, another way that you can think about grammar, if you like, is to think of collocation as a kind of grammar. We often think about collocations, about prepositions as being grammar. You know, are prepositions grammar? Are prepositions collocation? Does it really matter? You know, what obviously really matters is that students get exposed to these things. They're encouraged to notice differences and to notice how language works in relation to other language. I've got a Spanish lad in my intermediate class at the moment, and every time he talks about his job, he always says, I am the responsible of, okay? Which is the Spanish grammatical, lexical way of expressing that idea. In English, of course, I'm responsible as an adjective, not a noun as in Spanish. I'm responsible for hiring and firing. Interestingly, not I'm responsible for firing and hiring. Has to be hiring and firing. Why? Because we always say it that way round, like fish and chips and rock and roll and left and right and up and down. I'm responsible for corporate and social responsibility. Lucky you. I'm responsible for taking minutes at meetings. But then it gets complicated and interesting because when you look at the noun, okay, it's the responsibility of taxi drivers to know their way around. It's the responsibility of language teachers to know their way around the language. And then when you look at the negative, okay, it's the responsibility of each and every one of us to remain vigilant during these troubled times. When you look at the negative, it's irresponsible of you too, okay? So, you know, again, each of these sort of items comes with their own grammatical priming. They come with their own kind of grammatical collocations, if you like, yeah? Or patterns, if you like. This also follows on to the idea of colligation. Just as collocation is, you know, words which like to get married, verbs which often go with nouns, adjectives which often go with nouns, adverbs that go with particular adjectives, etc., or verbs. Colligation is the grammatical patterns that words take. This idea of colligation, the kind of grammatical collocation of words, for me this is the way I've come to think about grammar more and more, really, because going back to the students we talked about earlier, the students who'll say to you, you know, I want to pass first certificate but I am worried of my grammar. Really what those students need to do is not to work their way through something like Murphy's Grammar in use again. Really what they need to do is to learn the colligations of the vocabulary that they've already learned and of new vocabulary. So lots of students, for example, might think that they know the word recommend, but they'll often use it with colligation patterns from their own language. So they'll say things like, what do you recommend me to do? Okay, instead of what do you recommend I do, or what do you think I should do even, yeah? So they won't know the kind of grammatical patterns that go with words they've learned. And you know, you think about it, some verbs, like the verb to be born, the colligation is pretty much always past simple passive. It's almost impossible to think of an example of born being used in an active form or even in many other tenses, yeah? The same kind of way, dubbed. this word that Alexander used in that mad letter we looked at earlier. Very frequently it's used in the past simple passive. You know, Bandung in Java was once dubbed the Paris of the East. If you Google, was once dubbed the Paris of the East, by the way. It's amazing how many places were once dubbed the Paris of the East. But again, it's often past simple passive. Earmarked, it's often present perfect passive. Yeah, the building's been earmarked for demolition. The area has been earmarked for redevelopment. So part of what fluent users must know about a word like earmarked is not just its meaning. They must also know the collocations. You know, buildings are earmarked for demolition, areas earmarked for redevelopment. But on top of that, they must also be primed through their experience of encountering the language to know something about the colligation, you know, the present perfect passive nature of the way in which it's often used. You think about phrases, you know, think about the word bother. Very common colligation of bother is I can't be bothered. Okay, we basically don't use it as a positive sentence. At the moment on TV, there's an advert for some particular company that I can't remember the name of, which shows you how effective the advert was. But the advert says, we can be bothered. Okay, and it's a clever phrase because, you know, they're subverting the use of it. They're obviously playing with the fact that we hardly ever use this as a positive sentence, and they're kind of creating a memorable catchphrase, if not for a memorable company, but by subverting the usual colligations. Okay, you know, that's what ad men are paid money to do. Think about things like surprising. It was really surprising. Can often make it negative. It wasn't that surprising. It wasn't really very surprising. It was quite astonishing, but it wasn't that astonishing. It wasn't very astonishing. We don't say it. Why not? That's not the colligation of the word astonishing, but it is the colligation of the word surprising. Okay? All of these things are facts that fluent users have to get their heads around, but they're not things that are going to be learned just by fretting about tenses and fretting about can, could, may, will, should, might, must. Another thing you can think about is patterns. Okay, you know, in a sense, all grammar is really just patterns. The present simple's a pattern, the future perfect's a pattern, the second conditional's a pattern, but so also is something like just because it doesn't mean. You know, contrary to popular belief, just because I'm a teacher, it doesn't mean I've failed at everything else. Just because I'm a man, it doesn't mean I can't cook. I've just done a very nice Thai chicken curry for my family. And to return to this band that me and Andy both love, the Specials, just because you're a black boy, just because you're a white, it doesn't mean you've got to hate him. It doesn't mean you've got to fight. And actually, there's a guy called Nick Ellis, who's a kind of psycholinguistics guy, I guess. And he talks a lot about this kind of idea of the way in which our experience and exposure to the way chunks work primes us to learn the kind of common meanings and common patterns behind them and to generate out from that. So if you take the idea of across, okay, going across a place, much of the usage when we talk about going across a place is taken by a very small number of verbs. So, you know, you go across a place, you move across a place, you travel across a place. You know, sort of 80% of the usage of across a place, it is 3 or 4 verbs, basically. And the reason that we can create other patterns around that, like, you know, slithered across the floor, drifted across the sky, stumbled across the yard, the reason we can do that is because all of those verbs are variations on the concept of go, and all of those endings are different kinds of places. Yeah, so our constant exposure to going across a place as a basic kind of pattern, basic concept, allows us to generate out other more sophisticated, or to decode when we meet other more sophisticated uses of that particular kind of construct. You can also think about grammar as discourse, okay? You know, kind of language in use. When I was at secondary school, I had an English teacher, and he told me, if you're ever stuck for something to write in an academic essay, here's the machine that generates your argument. It goes like this. While some believe that blah 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 blah, it nevertheless seems true to say that. blah, 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 blah. Obviously there's grammar in there, yeah? But basically you kind of remember and you learn that as a particular kind of pragmatic part of a sentence that propels an argument forward, that sets up a straw man, sets up a weak argument and allows you to argue against it. In the same kind of way, another feature of discourse, if you're writing things like letters of complaint or emails of complaint, we often have this kind of according to, we're supposed to, however, in reality kind of pattern, yeah? According to your brochure, the hotel was supposed to be on the beach, however, in reality, it was in the middle of a building site. According to your website, all of your teachers were supposed to be fully qualified, however, in reality, I was taught by a clown who hadn't even done a CELTA. And in spoken language as well, there's sort of discourse patterns that we're primed to expect and produce that have their own lexico-grammatical features built in. You think about a very basic conversation like, where are you from? Okay? We learn that and we remember that and we repeat that as a whole chunk, as an item of lexis, if you like. We often then follow up just by saying, whereabouts? Okay? Where are you from? China. Whereabouts? Beijing. Next question, discoursally, almost always, and are you from there originally? Okay, so you could look at that as grammar, you could look at that as discourse, you could look at it as the grammar of discourse. Again, what I would say is what's important is students need to see this kind of stuff, okay? And it's kind of grammar outside the traditional English language teaching canon, if you like. Grammar's often genre dependent, I can't say it, genre dependent. Okay, so things like texting, notes, informal conversation, advertising, letters to newspapers, ad infinitum, all have their own conventions, and this includes grammatical or lexicogrammatical conventions. We often think about the conventions in terms of the layout, that kind of thing, but actually, there's all kinds of other conventions. As we were saying earlier, a feature of letters to newspapers is often ellipsis. So this extract that Toby Young was ranting and raving about, actually what's happened is there's a kind of ellipsis of the fact, okay? An intelligent reader realises this because it's a letter to a newspaper. So, I can hear you asking out there in YouTube land, what are the classroom implications of all of this? Well, I think the first thing to say is the road is long, When students come to us expecting quick fixes and expecting us to give them a magic grammar book or some homework exercises which will solve all of their grammar problems, it's not going to work like that. It just doesn't happen. Yeah, basically the road to full competence in a language and full accuracy and fluency in a language. It's a long, lifelong kind of journey that we're all engaged in, native and non-native in a sense. And one thing that really is clear, I think, is competence isn't simply learned by studying rules and meanings and forms. Yeah, it can't be. If it was, then we would all have perfectly successful students after they've finished Murphy's in Use and memorised their word lists. But, we all know that doesn't happen. Instead, I think competence is learned slowly and it's learned from input, just as kids learn languages from input, basically, not from studying rules and forms and meanings. It's learned from whole sentences and it's learned from examples of discourse, whether that's spoken discourse or written discourse. It's learned from seeing lexis, new lexis, with the grammar that it's frequently used with, and at the same time it's learned from seeing grammar with the lexis it's frequently used with in whole sentences or in discourse. Yeah? It's learned from priming, it's learned from sort of input and noticing and input and noticing and input and noticing and being layered or conditioned or primed to expect language to then work in similar ways to the way it's worked previously. And if we don't have this kind of priming, or if the priming we have is radically different to the priming of many more fluent users, we end up with sort of weird, broken English, like the Alexander Perchov letter that you saw earlier. I think also, and it's a question for all of us, myself included really, Are we doing enough to encourage our students to read? Because priming must really come from massive amounts of input, and one of the best ways that you can force yourself to be exposed to massive amounts of input is to read. So, you know, it's a good thing for all of us to think about. Can we do more to get our students to read more? I think there are other things that may help, okay? And, you know, there may be things you're doing already. Explanation and learning rules can help, I think, especially early on. You know, it's important to learn the basic rules and to have the basic grammar structures explained to you. I would obviously never say it wasn't. I just think as teachers we need to be aware of the limitations of that kind of approach. And we need to be aware of the fact that once we've explained and students have learned the rules and forms, just doing that doesn't help you say very much. So, you know, learning that the present continuous is I am, you are, he is plus ing. It doesn't help you say it's pouring down outside, or prices are plummeting all across Far Eastern markets, or you're always undermining my confidence. You know, that has to be learned through exposure and through input, as opposed to just having the rules explained to you again in the hope that you'll get better at the present continuous. Context is obviously important, and trying to elicit ideas from students is important. We often think about this kind of thing in terms of PPP, present, practice, produce kind of lessons, where we set up a context and we elicit a bit of grammar from the students. Like, you know, maybe you've done something like this yourself. You come running into the room, you're breathless, you're acting and hamming it up, kind of going, and eventually you'll elicit from the students, you've been running, and you use this for your PPP kind of presentation stage to do the present perfect continuous. But there's no reason why you can't also do this with chunks, okay? The other day I was teaching my pre-intermediate group, and this chunk, I'm in a rush, came up, and we had this sentence on the board: look, I'd love to stop and talk, but I'm in a rush, sorry. And I elicited from students reasons why they're in a rush, and you then rephrase that. So they'll say things like, my class begins, will begin, is beginning, is going to begin, must begin in 5 minutes. And you say, okay, yeah, sorry I'm late, I'm in a rush. My class starts in 5 minutes. What tense is it? Present simple. Why? Timetable. Any other reasons why I'm in a rush? Students say things like, I have appointment, my girlfriend. You make a cheap joke about, is your girlfriend a doctor? Is she a dentist? No. So, I'm meeting my girlfriend in 5 minutes. Yeah, what tense is it? Present continuous. Why? Future arrangement. And you go on like that, yeah? So, you know, it's a way of getting at grammar in the context of usage, in the context of spoken discourse. And it's a way of going over the rules for things that they've studied already in a simple, quick kind of way. So I think a lot of that kind of thing is good. Encouraging noticing, yeah? And this can include encouraging students to notice grammar that they meet in vocabulary exercises. So it may be you're doing a vocabulary exercise and, you know, there's an example of the present perfect in there. And you just quickly say, oh, by the way, what tense is it here? That's right, the present perfect. Why? From the past to now. Good, just checking, well noticed. Can include a kind of intermediate and above maybe. Guided discovery, more kind of inductive learning. This is basically a kind of more sophisticated version of number one. In fact, it's probably predicated on the assumption they've already done number one. So rather than explaining and learning the rules, here you turn the rules into questions, you know, and you just check, you guide them towards, you know, discovering's the wrong word really, but you guide them towards showing you whether or not they have previously understood and learned the rules. Further things that may help: two-way translation, okay? I think it's something I've talked about a lot before, but I think translation's had a very bad rep over recent years. But actually, you know, whether you like it or not, your students translate. And often what they'll do is they'll bring the primings or the way they're conditioned to expect language to work from their first language into their second language, of course. And two-way translation can help. If you take a chunk, you know, an item of lexis or grammar, however you want to see it, like I haven't seen you for ages. You translate it into a first language of the students. For a lot of students, it will translate directly as something like, "It is a long time since I didn't see you." Okay? They write down the translation in their own first language. Next week, they come to class or they test themselves. They look at the translation. They try to remember exactly the English. The bad students will have forgotten the English and will just translate badly and say something like, "It's a long time I didn't see you." They then check it against the English and they kind of notice the gap. So this kind of two-way translation into the mother tongue and then back into English is a way of forcing students to become more conscious of the gap that exists between the way the two languages express ideas. Close exercises, they're good things to do, I think, where you're kind of gapping things. They're particularly good for the kind of off-canon bits that we often miss. So things like, just because it doesn't mean. You gap the word because, or you gap the word mean, and you draw their attention to it. You test them, you see if they're aware of it. Gap fills can be good. Choosing the best form can be good. Transformations can be good so long as you're careful. I have a real issue with things like transforming a first conditional into a second conditional, or a kind of basic active sentence into the passive, because the things we say in first conditionals we often don't say as second conditionals, because that's just the way things work. Things we say as active sentences we often don't say as passives. I'm often reminded of a Russian student I had years ago when we were doing the passive, and she said, "I know the passive. The dog is walked by me, I walk the dog." It's like, right, that first sentence, why would you tell someone the dog is walked by me? But, transformations like this, I'd rather not, prefer, I'd prefer not to. Do you want to go out? Do you fancy going out? This is actually much closer to the kind of thing that the Cambridge exams test, the first certificate and the CAE and the use of English sections. And I think these are good exercises. They're good things for students to learn and to be aware of. The kind of small, nitty-gritty kind of lexico-grammatical patternings. I think drills are really good, particularly if you're showing the phonetic or phonological envelopes. So if you're drilling things like, "I haven't seen you for ages. I haven't been there for ages. I haven't tried that for ages. I haven't seen you for months. I haven't seen him for years." Where you're kind of showing the variation of the chunks and you're encouraging the students to learn the phonological envelope that those chunks usually come wrapped up in. Negotiating meaning, basically talking to your students and correcting them. So, asking them, "Oh, you have a brother, older or younger?" "Oh, 2 years younger." "And how often do you see him?" When the student says, "Oh, it is a long time I didn't see him," you correct it and say, "Yeah, I haven't seen him for ages." What tense is it? Present perfect. Why? From the past to now. Very good. Okay? So this action of kind of talking, listening, reformulating, interrupting, pointing out, and basically teaching, because that's what that is, and that's what we are. We are language teachers. Okay. A final note of caution, really. As I spoke about right at the beginning, this whole idea of English as a lingua franca, if grammar is really not something permanently fixed as correct, but really just a set of shared understandings, as language teachers, even though we want to move our students towards what most fluent users regard as correct usage of the language, lexically and grammatically, we have to be aware of level, and we have to be aware of interlanguage. And perhaps, we need to sort of not be too hard on students sometimes. We need to accept that, learning is long, learning slow, accuracy comes very, very slowly, it comes in fits and spurts. It's often connected to the acquisition of particular kind of chunks or particular kind of blocks of discourse or particular repertoires. I think also we need to just bear in mind the fact that in international communication, grammar is hardly ever what actually causes problems. Much bigger problem is vocabulary and pronunciation, actually. And as a result, one of the messages I'd like you to take away from this is maybe we need to worry slightly less about what we traditionally think of as grammar and slightly more about areas like vocabulary and pronunciation. and you know, just to really think about whether or not we're worrying about the right thing. So just to wrap up, okay, and to give you another example of creativity based on slot filling, some advice. We've taken a few liberties and changed this poem around slightly, but kept the basic slot. This is based on a poem by the ex-poet laureate Philip Larkin, and he had a very famous poem called "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They don't mean to, but they do." Okay, so you know, with slight apologies to the late great Philip Larkin, here's some advice from him. They fuck you up, your language teachers. They may not mean to, but they do. They plague you with their rules of grammar, with extra homework just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time had games and fun, and half murphied you round the throat. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can. And don't obsess about grammar yourself. Finally, obviously, it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that as course book writers, Andrew and myself have obviously tried to take a broader approach to grammar and to really try to get teachers and get students to think about grammar in a larger, broader sense than just the kind of classic, I don't know, English file, Raymond Murphy's in Grammar in Use canon, if you like. And if you're interested, you can have a look at our course books called Outcomes, published by National Geographic Learning. We're working on second editions at the moment. And just one final thing to mention. I blog myself at this address here. Andrew blogs at www.blog.westminster.ac.uk/celt. And if you're that way inclined, you can find us on Facebook and you can like us there. Anyway, I hope you enjoy the talk, and I look forward to seeing any questions or any comments that you may post underneath. Okay, thank you very much. Good night.